to the first session of this conference. Before continuing on to our presenters, Professor Sybille and I would like to shortly introduce the background why we dedicated the session to urban routines. By exploring urban routines, we hope to open a productive discussion of the making of cities as a process which has continuously been driven in a tension between, on the one hand, patterns of settling of the urban order, and on the other, the rupturing moments of its unsettling. The dynamics of urbanization have undoubtedly been structurally configured and conditioned by capital accumulation and regulation regimes. At the same time, urban space and time scales have been produced through and mirrored in complex practices and relationships between individuals and society. These practices and relationships have been conceived of, contested, dismissed, and curbed through an infinite range of urban routines. US American philosopher Theodore Shepsky defined urban routines as a set of iterative doings and sayings within and across which social order is brought about and determined. These doings and sayings are actions that people perform bodily without much thinking. Examples he mentions are hammering, handing over money, or steering a wheel. Complex practices such as building a house, or shopping, or driving a car are actually constituted of these routinized actions. German sociologist Andreas Reppitz emphasized that routines do not only encompass relations between subjects or between subjects and things, but also relations to oneself, including the body, the motivations, emotions. We hence understand urban routines as sets of doings, sayings, tasks, projects, and feelings through which individuals, collectives, and institutions tacitly or purposefully interact with urban space, nature, and society. Phenomenology has tended to approach urban routines with regard to the dichotomy between, on the one hand, almost unconsciously performed mundane practices which are a result of pre-reflective tacit knowledge, and on the other, thought through and consciously produced practices invested with meaning. Needless to say, any attempt to draw clear boundaries between these two dimensions of urban routines would be counterproductive. We may think of kids skateboarding in front of a town hall, or routines of how cities are governed, or how economies are organized and performed, how performative acts shape public places, or how professionals imagine, conceive of, or conceptualize the city, or how political activists disrupt the political celebration. How could we determine to what extent these routines are invested or not with a meaning in their daily repetitive occurrence? The implicit dialectics between settling the urban order through routines and unsettling routines through reflexive, meaningful action have permeated scientific debates since the early articulated concerns about the alienating impacts of industrial cities on the human body. At the beginning of the 20th century, Georg Simmel prominently noted that urban routines both reproduce and mirror an intrinsic conflict of the modern urban society. He articulated this conflict by putting the individual's relentless struggle for liberation from traditional social ties into dialectics with the individual's coping mechanisms for adapting to the unsettling experience of uprooting metropolitan space. Against this background, Simmel developed the concept of blasé attitude. The blasé attitude is the ultimate urban routine that helps the modern city dweller to cope with the constant intensification of nervous stimulation in the metropolitan setting. At the same time, it enables the individual to selectively engage in meaningful interactions with others. Sociology and cultural theory have largely drawn on Anthony Giddens, Pierre Bourdieu's, and Henri Lefebvre's notions to conceptualize routines as emerging in two-directional dynamics of individuals internalizing the social order and their agency to challenge and transform that social order. Let me utilize again a somewhat ubiquitous example of skaters in public space. By practicing their performance as part of a daily routine, these men and women internalize norms and values of their urban culture, while at the same time socializing in regard to a broader society as they negotiate the meanings of the place they occupy. In this largely unpremeditated dynamics, the skaters gain the agency to create change. This dynamics surfaced in the struggle of skaters on London's South Bank in their effort to keep their space under the Queen Elizabeth Hall. Not only did they manage to politically articulate their claims as cultural value against commercial developments, but they have also managed to mobilize broader publics and have eventually received support from London's then Mayor Boris Johnson. Andreas Reckwitz, in his theorizing on social practices, thus regards individuals as carriers of routinized, over-subjective complexes of bodily movements, of forms of interpreting, knowing how and wanting, and the usage of things. Routines, therefore, carry strong collective notions of continuity and social constraints. With the scientific focus directed at interrogating power relations in everyday life, urban routines are broadly regarded as carriers of meanings through which public life unfolds. At the same time, following Anthony Giddens, bodies and minds have the agency to produce positive change, which is why urban routines are also imbued with hope of sheer possibilities, that the capacity of the human body to improvise and invent can open against social constraints. This also means that routines entail a plethora of ethical dimensions connected to their creating, upholding, and contesting. These ethical dimensions concern, but are not restricted to, social differences such as age, gender, class, or ethnicity. They more often than not go unrecognized. feminist, queer, and cultural studies have critically expanded on the debates that had focused on rational dimensions of urban routines, by putting affect in the foreground of their considerations. For example, Silvia Federici has reminded us that affective encounter is loaded with class and gender structures of oppression, exploitation, and struggle. As such, affect is channeling both a hope-filled action and the one of fear and distrust towards difference.
So by discussing urban routines as meaningful social practices, we would like to illustrate in this session how moments of settling and unsettling of urban orders simultaneously coexist in space and time in a mutual influence relationship. We would like to show that alongside rupturing moments of unsettling, urban routines too can mobilize and make change. Besides, any positive change made possible in a moment of unsettling gains ground only when reproduced as part of daily urban routine. Routines can also be an adequate answer to continuous unsettlement, which becomes apparent in the adoption of the blasé attitude that we just mentioned, thought of by Sybille, or they can take the shape of routines of crisis, also as an answer to continuous unsettlement. Moreover, urban routines are inseparable part of rupturing moments of unsettling. For example, the notions of what bodies can do or cannot do and how they can be sustained often play a central role in grand historical crises and events. For example, Iranian sociologist Asef Bayat, that was mentioned earlier, again by Sabine, he delivered a profound account on the agency of ordinary people to make change through their routinized daily lives. He argues that, I quote him, collective actions embody shared practices of ordinary people whose fragmented but similar activities trigger much social change, unquote. His scrutiny of the Muslim Middle East showed that daily activities, regardless how mundane they are, continuously question and challenge the settled urban social order. Rob Shields refers to Lefebvre to conceptualize routines in everyday life in a similar dialectical manner. While banal and meaningless dimensions of routines render everyday life trivial and alienating, the routines are simultaneously carriers of great potential, which produces moments of possibility. By this, routines continuously revise the boundaries of possible and impossible. As other accounts in this session, this position reflects a growing awareness that knowledge on cities we are using and contributing to on a daily basis has predominantly been produced from the perspective of power. This poses numerous ethical questions and concerns regarding the researcher's positionality in the research field, and calls for a criticism of routinized practices of research. These questions and concerns can be addressed productively through a reflexive engagement in the production of knowledge on urban routines, and this is also one of the aims of this session as we hope. As we described, critique on urban routines has implicitly been centered on dialectical relations developed between, on the one hand, unsettling moments invested with meaning, and, on the other hand, settled, mundane, reoccurring encounters and experiences of everyday life. While we take this dialectics as our point of departure, this session will show that empirical approaches scrutinizing how urban routines constitute urban materialities and narratives are multidimensional, and their insights even more so nuanced. Our speakers will demonstrate that mundane daily practices can be invested with meaning more often than we recognize it, and rupturing moments of unsettling are impossible to separate from mundane practices. Oren Yiftachel of Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, who will be the first speaker of our session today, will develop a conceptual framework. His framework aims to understand how the shaping of new urban regimes interconnects the disrupting moments of unsettling, consciously produced and performed actions, and mundane routines of doing business as usual. Upon arrival of a large number of migrants to impoverished neighborhoods of Tel Aviv, local marginalized populations organized in protest, which has not prevented the continuation of thorough urban transformations. His contribution will be followed by Evangelia Athanasiou of Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Her paper will focus on public space as both a medium and a means for understanding consciously unsettled relationships between bodies and society. Her paper will investigate the changing routines of young people in urban public space who increasingly hang out in city squares and streets instead of traditional places of consumerism, such as cafes. She will connect her observations to broader notions of growing social constraints, as well as the human agency that these informal encounters and mundane gathering practices produce. Tomorrow morning, on the second day of this conference, the theme of our session on urban routines will be recaptured by Michael Dring of Birmingham City University. His talk will cast a historical perspective of the Birmingham Library to draw attention to the fact that seemingly routinized practices of governing and administrating cities are actually consciously unsettled. He will demonstrate that the ways and means of producing and reproducing private and public places and institutions of cities have been contested and transformed by the forces of emergent forms of civic life. In his contribution about churches built by former slaves in Texas, architect Gabriel Cuellar from the United States will put emphasis on complex dynamics of routinized worship practices. Since the 19th century, these churches have been nurturing collectivity within Afro-American church groups. At the same time, they produce significant political agency to challenge the unsettling social conditions of freed men and women. Seemingly mundane, but in reality heavily contested worship practices have thus rendered churches political battlefields of emancipation and liberation. The last contribution, prepared by Sandra Kurfürst of University of Cologne, will show how daily practices of breakdancing and emceeing in Vietnam are challenging the state's dominance over urban public space. Performers occupy squares as part of their daily practice, thus not only negotiating meanings of the place, but also questioning the political status quo and the social order. So after these introductory words to this session on urban routines, we are now looking forward to many stimulating contributions that will investigate how urban routines are being unsettled, reintroduced, or invented anew in conditions of unsettled. First of all, as I announced before, I would like to call Professor Oren Yiftachel to the floor.